So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to People's Agony Expert Series. First things first, hi, I'm Marley, sending my warmest gratitude to all of you here, all the way from the Philippines, and it's a pleasure to be the moderator of today's session. And just a quick reminder, if anyone of you have questions to ask that you would like Michael to address, so there's two ways that you can do it. So the first one is you can unmute yourself and ask away. And the second one, if you're a shy type, you can send it through the chat box because I'll be monitoring it and I'll ask Michael on your behalf. Sounds good? Okay. Moving forward, those who have joined us for the past sessions have known this already, but for the first timers, you may be wondering why Agony Expert Series? So we have drawn inspiration from an agony aunt, who by definition is a person who writes a column in a newspaper or magazine in which they reply to readers who have written to them for advice on their personal problems. So in short, it's kind of a play on that concept, thus the agony expert that we have now, where you, our participants, can share what problems and struggles you're facing within your organization and seek insight directly from our expert today. So this session is just the eighth of the many, by the way. So as you can see on the screen, together with a total of 17 world-class experts that we have gathered, they will be covering 8 different topics that are timely and relevant in our industry today. And well, the good news is you can cherry pick what session you'd like to attend, or maybe sign up for all if you want. So we would love to welcome you all throughout the session. And today it will be about leading with compassion. So it's an honor to introduce our guest expert, Michael Jenkins, the CEO of Expert Humans, that was founded in April 2020 in Singapore. So the company brings individual and shared interests into play through working together, combining a long-standing and deep interest in what makes people think and behave the way they do. And also, he authored the book Expert Humans, Critical Leadership Skills for a Disrupted World, which examines the critical leadership concept of altruism, compassion, and empathy, and what we call the ACE model, and their application to the great disruptors of today. And now he will speak about the ACE concept, psychological safety and trust, and well-being at work. And just a little bit of a background of who we are. So People is a consulting firm that started in 2004, sold itself and relaunched last year, 2020, with a consulting model geared towards the future of work. Our team serves both our clients and our network of over 1,000 experts. So who are these experts? We have consultants, business leaders, thought leaders, researchers, and tech partners. So together, we deliver consulting work, speaking engagements, lunch and learns, training, coaching, instructional design, organizational, and people diagnostics. Our experts deliver work across 6 broad domains: people, digital innovation, business, sustainability, change management, and design. So in short, people can attend to any business challenge you might have. So do check out our website and find out more about us at www.ppro.com. So that's PPRO. So that's Pro with double P. Okay. And just a quick run through of what's going to happen today. We have Michael to address the group for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, followed by Q&A with you for another 20 to 25 minutes. And then we will go and wrap things up for you in the last remaining 5 minutes for us to get feedback of what you think of today's session. And again, we'd love to receive your questions and drop them in the chat box, and we'll address them during the Q&A session. Okay, so today's topic is really interesting, so I won't keep you any longer. I'm handing it over to you, Michael. The floor is yours.
Marley, thank you very much indeed for the warm welcome, and a very warm welcome to everybody from all over the world. So I'm really looking forward to the session with you today. Let me just pull up the slide deck. So hopefully you can all see that. And as Marley said, we'll be going through a very short slide show just to begin with. And these are the items that I hope to cover with you today. So looking at altruism, compassion, and empathy, and all of those items that Marley mentioned. And I think if time allows, reflections on workplace mental well-being would be great. But most important of all, your thoughts and your concerns and your issues as well, because I think sharing issues is a great way to help other people as well. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So just to get us located a little bit in the topic, empathy and compassion, I think you might agree, have really entered the business lexicon as a result of COVID-19. I remember probably 8, 9, maybe even 10 years ago, trying to talk to business leaders about particularly compassion, and often finding that people were only mildly interested in sort of thinking about compassion. Whereas I think we've got a sea change now. And I would say that in particular, empathy is a topic that I'm hearing a lot of business leaders talking about at the moment. And I'd like to chat with you a bit later about why that might be so. Why is it that empathy seems to be so much more accessible as a topic area than compassion at the moment? I'm hoping that that will gradually change over time. In terms of the research, I'm going to be sharing an entire deck with you all post the session. So the slides that I'm sharing today are just a small selection of the entire slide deck that I had prepared to share with you after the session today. So this is just summarizing some of the things that we know about compassion and empathy at the moment. So as you'll probably quickly read there, I'll just pick out a few as we go through, but very importantly, I think compassion promotes commitment to the organization. So right there, we see a business imperative around creating a more human workplace, because if people feel emotionally attached to the organization, that's going to do good things for the organization overall. We know that compassion breeds compassion. So the more they see their leaders exhibiting compassionate behavior and compassionate leadership, the more inclined people are to sort of say, hey, that looks interesting. I'll try some of that. Amazing thing from a brain chemistry point of view, compassion works both ways. So very often the person who is giving or carrying out the compassionate act actually benefits enormously as well from a mental well-being perspective. And compassion fosters collaboration in the workplace. So as you can see, and as you glance through there, reducing staff turnover, strengthening bonds, very importantly, reducing the potential for burnout and helping better mental health. All of these things, I think, are things that I'm sure everyone around the table is very aware of. Another thing that I think is super important for those of you who are what I might call empathy and compassion champions within your organizations or with your own clients, for example, creating that kind of human workplace where people feel that their opinion is valued and that they can express what they are really thinking, creates some fantastic conditions for innovation as well. So innovation and creativity as a business driver can benefit enormously if we have more human workplaces. In terms of empathy, both the literature and I think lived experience shows that empathy can be very, very helpful in all of these different areas. Specifically, better outcomes in healthcare. There's an interesting study which took 2 cohort groups in a care environment, a care homes environment in the United States. And they put one cohort group through what they call in the US virtuousness training, which we might sort of think more in terms of being compassion and empathy training. And they found that over a period of time, first they measured it at 3 years and 5 years, and the cohort group that had gone through the training not only met and exceeded their KPIs, but very excitingly, the people who were within their care, the people they were looking after, actually lived longer. So imagine that, being able to sort of create a situation where people that you're looking after actually live longer. That has got to be a really fantastic thing. And I think for all of us around the table, that aspect of empathy as being a key skill for leaders across cultures and diverse teams, that ability to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, probably what we would term more specifically as cognitive empathy. And for those of you who are interested in delving a little bit deeper, you could probably look at Microsoft's experience and the activities of the chair, Satya Nadella, in intentionally building a culture of empathy within Microsoft. And it's completely changed the organization. Marley very kindly mentioned this very simple model. I call it the ACE model. It looks like a dartboard. We've got altruism in the middle. Compassion is the middle circle, empathy on the outside. One of the positions I've taken is that compassion and empathy are different. And the biggest difference is that with empathy, empathy doesn't necessarily imply that you're going to take action to alleviate the stress or the pain of a person. So for example, we can empathize with someone, empathize with the situation, but the big thing about compassion is that it's very action oriented. And that's one of the biggest differences between the two. Altruism for me is an aspirational thing. So this is where we find we're doing good things for people because it's good to do those things. And I'll show you what I mean a little bit later. What we wanted to do, have a little bit of fun with you, is to just ask you, in terms of altruism, compassion, and empathy, and how beneficial they could be for mental health, because we know that creating more human workplaces is advantageous for better mental well-being of our colleagues, friends, and compatriots. What do you guys think is currently, I say currently, the biggest source of global mental ill health? Is it depression? Is it anxiety, bipolar disorder, drug use disorder, alcohol use disorder, maybe eating disorders, or perhaps schizophrenia? I'm going to sort of ask for a little bit of help to do this little Mentimeter poll. Marley, can I hand over to you to pick up the reins?
Yeah, sure. So to our participants today, so there's a link of the Mentimeter where you can save where you can send your answers to this question. So the code is also flashed into the chat box. So you can enter that as well.
Brenta just mentioned, does unprocessed anxiety lead to the other disorders? I think it's a really, really good observation. I think the answer is quite possibly. At this stage, we're sort of looking at the high level in terms of what you guys think are the biggest sort of sources of global mental ill health at the moment. So I think we've got most of the responses in.
Yep.
Fantastic. Well, I think you all have your finger on the pulse of what's going on. We've got a couple more votes coming in there. And we can see that within the group, most people are opting for anxiety as the biggest source of mental ill health today. Yes, and it's building in terms of what we think. So that's really, really interesting. Thank you for that. I'll just give a couple more moments to enable people to vote. But it does seem that anxiety is the one that we think is the biggest source of global mental ill health. Thank you. Yeah, okay. So Marley, are we able to go back to the main slide deck?
Okay, sure.
Fantastic. So I'll share my screen again. So I think the considered opinion for everyone was that we thought anxiety was the biggest issue here. And let me just show you some data. Prevalence by mental and substance use disorder. This is some world data from 2017. One of the reasons why this is the latest source that I can get, because it takes quite a long time for an organization like our World in Data to wrap up all of the data that they have to come up with this kind of picture. But as you guys quite rightly pointed out, anxiety disorders are the top of the list. And I guess one of the reasons why I wanted to do this with you is that I have a very simple proposition, which is that if we were able to leverage more human workplaces by being and promoting empathy and compassion, how wonderful would it be if we could shift the needle such that we are able to tackle the anxiety that people clearly feel across the world today? And how beneficial would that be not only for human beings, but also for the organizations that they work for? So with that in mind, I'll just linger on this for a moment. For those of you who are in Singapore, you can see as you glance through this, that there has been an uptick in demand for support of people who are going through a difficult period in terms of their mental well-being as a result of the COVID situation. And then if we look more globally, you'll see here data from the UK and from the US shows a significant increase in COVID-related mental ill health issues. I'm actually joining you from Edinburgh in Scotland today. And just in the UK papers yesterday, they were reporting an explosion in mental health related issues, such that the social services and mental health support networks in the UK are now severely under pressure. And one of the biggest pressure points, in fact, is amongst adolescents and young people as a result of what we're going through at the moment. So the problem, if you like, is quite clearly there. And I wanted to therefore just pause for a moment and give you guys an opportunity to reflect on what we've just touched on so far, and then we'll scamper on through the rest of the few slides that I've got. So any thoughts, anybody, so far in terms of what you're seeing, perhaps in your country as well? So please feel free to let us know what you think.
We actually have one question from our participant, from Dennis.
Yes. Yes.
So where is this anxiety coming from? So what's the source?
Lovely question. Well, okay, Sharon's suggesting maybe a lack of social interaction, job security. Thank you for that, Sharon. Yes, absolutely. Well, you know, Dennis, it's a great question. And one of the really interesting things is that even pre-COVID, I think many of us would agree that there was already a mental health issue in the workplace around the world, even before COVID came. And COVID has if you like, exacerbated a problem that we already had before. In terms of where I'm coming from, Dennis, and in terms of leadership, I wanted to posit the notion that a lot of this anxiety actually comes from both managers and to a certain degree co-workers in organizations, but particularly from managers. Dennis, what do you think? Where do you think this anxiety is coming from? And feel free to pop it into the chat, or if you'd like to speak, then that's great as well.
So we have a comment coming from Amanda.
Amanda,
high levels of anxiety in Australia too, and particularly amongst teenagers. So not being able to switch off from social media is one of the challenges.
Indeed. Thanks, Amanda. Yes, really good observation. Dennis has said anxiety from work. Yes. So I think one of the simple propositions that I have is that if we could somehow improve the nature of the workplace, in other words, the way that managers and leaders interact with their people. And Dennis, you've added in there untrusting bosses, right? Yeah. A big thing that we're hearing is, how can I performance manage somebody when I can't see them? Which of course is looking in the wrong place for the answer. It's about building trust. So really good observation there. Sharon has also mentioned the graying of the line between work and personal space when we're working from home. Exactly, these are really good points. So if we hold on to those thoughts for a moment, and I just scamper on through my slide deck, just return very briefly to the ACE model. And I wanted to just say a little bit about what I mean by all of these different items. And so looking at altruism very quickly, I'm only going to sort of touch on these for just a moment, but just for us to be clear, altruism is the moral practice of concern, okay, for the happiness of other people. And what's super interesting about altruism is that it comes in many different forms. So I'll provide this to you later for you to have a bit more of an opportunity to look through it. But you can see their general altruism is the motivation to do good things for others. And I do believe there is scope for us to work more in the area of altruism. I was skeptical to a certain degree about how organizations might embrace the concept of altruism today, but with the emergence of sustainability as such a critical thing for us in the world today, the idea that organizations need to work not just to promote a sustainable business model themselves, but to actually help the world is a very interesting thought, which is being embraced by more and more people. So altruism is, I think, going to be something that we're going to see a lot more of. In terms of compassion, I wanted to spend just a few moments to deconstruct compassion. And forgive me, many of you may well be familiar with some of these items. But sometimes when people say, "Yeah, I'd love to be a more compassionate manager, but I don't really know how to do it. You know, what do you do?" So here are just some things which I would normally share with participants who are looking at compassion. So one is around listening. So how well do you actually listen to people, and are you actually present for them when you are listening to them? Might seem obvious, but I'm sure for those of you who've interacted with managers across the world, very often people in a self-reported sense will regard themselves as very good listeners, whereas in fact other people do not experience them as being good listeners. Likewise, it's very easy to be judgmental, and so when people come to us with issues, it's a very human reaction to sort of say, well, you know, it's your own fault. You know, you made your bed, you have to lie in it. But the thing here is we need to stop doing that and meet people where they are. So it's about being non-judgmental. There's this very interesting concept too of distress tolerance, which is around avoiding what we might call over-identification with the person's problems. So there are some people who are what you might call super empaths, who are able to almost experience viscerally, physically, the pain of some other individual that they're interacting with. And what we need to do in order to be of service to others is make sure that we have emotional bandwidth. And so we need to look after ourselves as well. And I'll say a little bit more about, in fact, self-compassion in a moment. This is where I place empathy. So you see, empathy is more for me a subset of compassion. And empathy is about not jumping to solutions mode. So sometimes when we're trying to be helpful to others, we listen to their issue, we process it, and then we come up with an answer. I find I do that all the time. I try not to, but I think what we really need to do is to try to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, and at the same time learn more about human behavior. I mentioned that compassion is about action, and that's the big difference between compassion and empathy. One small health warning is to check that your compassion is welcome, because sometimes we wish to be compassionate to others, but maybe they don't want us to be compassionate for whatever reason. So we need to be very alive to where the person is at that particular moment. In terms of self-compassion, for those of you who are interested in self-compassion, you may have already come across the American thinker Kristin Neff. That's N-E-F-F, Kristin, and she's one of the, I think, world authorities on self-compassion. I believe that this is something that's really critical for avoiding burnout, and it's about not sort of spoiling yourself or treating yourself. If anything, it's about forgiving yourself of the things that you think are not so good about you or about the things that you do, and it's absolutely critical for avoiding burnout. Dennis had mentioned untrusting bosses, and I wanted to just share with you a kind of work in progress. Be interested to hear what you think about this. But when we talk about leadership and leading with compassion, this is a little 2x2 that I've been experimenting with. And if you'll bear with me for a moment, I wanted to posit the notion that a true leader is someone who has high compassion. So they really are compassionate towards others, but they're also very good at self-compassion as well. They have self-compassion in great quantity for themselves. In the top left-hand quadrant, you'll find what I've termed the people that are called the martyrs, if you like. So these are people who have high compassion, so they spend a lot of time thinking about other people, and they spend very little time thinking about themselves. In the bottom left-hand quadrant, we have what I've called the nihilists. So this is a very bleak place, and this is where we find people who have low compassion, they have low self-compassion. It's a very grim kind of part of the quadrant to be. And then perhaps most interesting, and this is where I'd be interesting to see whether it resonates for you guys, the quadrant which has the narcissist in it. So this is where we have people who have low compassion in terms of others. So they really don't care about other people that much. But what we see is that they have an inordinate interest in themselves. And this is where, if you like, self-compassion morphs and shapes into a complete self-absorption. So it changes into something else. And this is where we find the narcissistic leader. And I'm absolutely sure that for all of us around the table, we can think of individuals that we've interacted with in our work careers who fall into this category of narcissist. And the reason why I wanted to mention this is that compassion is also about calling out toxic behavior in organizations. And I think that one of the roles of the leaders up in the top right-hand quadrant is to really identify this kind of toxic behavior that we see from narcissists and try, if possible, to do something to mitigate the worst excesses of these people. Okay, Natasha mentions, very interesting, this concept of super empaths. Is there a questionnaire that allows people to measure how far along they are on this scale? Nat, there are a number of questionnaires out there, and also within psychometric tools that exist at the moment, there are some ways to perhaps start to get at this particular item. But in all honesty, I haven't seen a tool that specifically addresses these super empaths, as I've just decided to call them. But thank you for your question. In terms of empathy, super quick, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. There are now reports which show, if you like, a gap or a disparity between the perception that CEOs have of how empathetic their organizations are compared with the lived experience of employees within those organizations. And this report is called Workplace Empathy: What Leaders Don't Know Can Hurt Them. And you'll be able to have a look at that if you are interested post-session. Interestingly, I asked the question earlier, why is it that empathy seems to be so much more accessible to business leaders at the moment than the word compassion? And I think it's because empathy has, if you like, a kind of quasi-scientific ring to it. It's actually a relatively new word, as you can see here. It comes from the German word Einfühlung, which means in feeling. And it was translated into English as empathy. It became, by 1913, the generally accepted translation of Einfühlung as a result of German psychologists moving to American universities. And so empathy, surprisingly, the word, I mean, I suppose the concept itself has a relatively short history. But empathy is, as I say, something that seems to be much more accessible at the moment. This is a simple table just to compare sympathy, which is the other item that comes into the picture. I've been quite brutal here in terms of saying that I think showing empathy is a good and generous thing, but I don't believe that it's truly useful in improving the human condition. And the reason why I say that is that I don't think it implies significant action. So again, you can look at that at your leisure. The other issue that we have with empathy is that it is very subject to bias. And for those of you who are interested in looking at that, Paul Bloom, a Canadian psychologist who works out of Yale, he's written this book which is called Against Empathy. He's actually very pro-empathy, but in his book he shows us that we tend to be able to empathize more with people that are like us than people that we don't know very well. So, psychological safety. What does it look like, and why is it important? We'll come back to that in just a moment, in the interests of time. I wanted to touch on the work of John Bowlby, who helped us to come up with the concept of the secure base. And this is where we ask ourselves the question, as a manager or a leader, are you a secure base for the people who you work with and who you lead? And a secure base is so important because it enables people to have that feeling of being safe, being able to experiment. How do you know if there isn't psychological safety in your organization? Again, I'm sure people around the table are very aware of these items, and this is just a sort of little table that shows you, you can use it as a litmus test. So when you have psychological safety, you can openly share your struggles, for example, whereas where there's no psychological safety, you'll tend to only push your strengths. John, thank you. You've mentioned sympathy perhaps maybe a useful stepping stone or trigger for empathy. Yes, fair point, fair point. Thank you, John. So that's the end of the slide deck. As you will see later when we send you the full deck, there's a lot more that I would like to share with you. But the focus of this session now for the remainder is really to have a conversation with you guys and see what you think, and also to hear from you, and to invite you to share stories or questions even that you have about all of the topics that we've touched on thus far. So I'll stop for a moment and give you guys an opportunity to reflect, and then we can start our conversation. So.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the wonderful presentation. So it's really wonderful to dig deeper and discuss about mental health in the workplace. And interestingly, it's more and more talked about today, unlike before, right? So also because personally here in the Philippines, the thing that Sharon shared about graying of line between work and personal space is really impacting the way my working friends my age work and they're coping with work, how they cope with their work. And the part where you discuss the deconstructing compassion, like one of them is don't be quick to judge. We don't really know what battle someone is fighting every day. So yeah, so there you go. We're now entering the Q&A part of the session. So if anyone have any questions, clarifications, comments, so now is the perfect time to bring that up, and Michael will address them. So go pop in the chat box or unmute yourself.
Indeed. Marnie, while people are sort of thinking about their question, there is one other thing I wanted to mention, which is, for those of you who are interested in this, the emergence of the concept of what we call weak tie networks. And I'll just pop it in the chat for a minute. Weak tie networks, I think, is also an emergent area of interest for, I think, everyone around the table. Weak tie networks are the relationships that we have with people in our everyday landscape. So it's the street cleaner outside your apartment. It's the barista in your local coffee shop, or it could be, the bus driver who takes your child to school. These are people who we recognize every day, and we say good morning. They say good morning, and what's happening in our brains is that they're recognizing us, we're recognizing them, and we're having this affirmation that we are taking up space in what we might call the cosmos. And hopefully that won't sound too woo-woo, but it's been shown, for example, in studies of people with Alzheimer's, with early onset dementia, for example, that they'll often say they don't feel noticed. And older people, for those of you who've got older relatives, very often they say, oh, I may as well not be around anymore because nobody notices me anyway. So this aspect, this need for human beings to be noticed is so important. And that's why weak tie networks, that ability to recognize people, to acknowledge them, and to say hello, to say good morning, is so very important. And taking the study a stage further, we now see that with COVID and with virtual working, for example, a lot of studies are starting to show that these weak tie networks are being compromised and that we're having less and less opportunity to truly, if you like, enjoy the benefits of weak tie networks. And the other thing, of course, is that weak tie networks, as opposed to strong tie networks are the networks of people that we have who we always go to for when we're worried about something, or we need ideas, or we need some help with something. We always go to the same people. And so weak tie networks, as another branch of this study, is being shown to be extremely important for innovation and creativity. So rather than going to the same people to ask what they think about things, throwing the net wider and intentionally trying to build your weak tie networks looks like one of the things that is going to become more and more important and interesting going forward. And as I say, the situation that we're in at the moment mitigates against that kind of thing. So weak tie networks, have a little read of that, and I think you'll find it very interesting. So Brent has said random acts of kindness is uplifting. Absolutely. I had a HR director who, in respect of what I was just talking about, weak tie networks, she said, I feel so bad that when I go into the factory every day, I don't actually know everybody's name. And I'm really trying very hard to remember everybody's name, because I think that's important. So I said to her, how many people do you have working in that factory? And she said, about 2,500. And I said, hey, you shouldn't beat yourself up. Trying to remember 2,500 names is a tall order for anyone. And I would say that if you have a goal for yourself, it's really to be able to walk around and say hello to people. People really appreciate that. And so when Brent says random acts of kindness is uplifting, Brent, I couldn't agree with you more. A tiny act of kindness can be so meaningful for the person at that particular moment. So we should continue to do that. And Sharon says, agree with you. So important to know everyone by their first name, whether you're the cleaner or the CEO. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I've been in Edinburgh now for about 2.5 weeks visiting my son. And I think the people in the equivalent to 7-Eleven, here in the UK, it's called Tesco Express. Yesterday, the guy said, hey, hello. In other words, I'm beginning to be recognized by the people. I don't even live in Edinburgh. And yet it made me feel very happy that that particular security guard was recognizing me. It's like, hey, I exist. And this is very important for people's mental well-being. So
We actually have a question from Amanda.
Yes, Amanda, yes.
Yeah. How can you build psychological safety in an unhealthy business environment? How do you start from scratch to overcome an unhealthy place?
Yeah. It's a great question, I was at a conference, and 2 guys came up to me after my talk about psychological safety and compassion and so forth. And they said, Michael, kind of liked what you said, but it would never work in our organization. It's way too toxic. And I said, well, what makes it toxic? And they said, well, our leaders, there's no way I could even dare to have a conversation with my leaders about anything like compassion or empathy. So nice idea, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do anything about it. So I said, well, how about this? Before you jump to that conclusion, why don't you think about one of the ideas, for example, coming from the American thinker Margaret Wheatley. Margaret Wheatley is an organization design specialist. She spent the best part of 30 years trying to think about what makes corporate systems and networks dysfunctional, and trying to think of ways to improve that. And she's most recently said that after 30 years of trying to change organizational systems, she's decided that perhaps for the rest of her life, she's going to concentrate on trying to improve things in her immediate vicinity. So working with your own team. Start with your own team. If you can't change the whole organization, start small and try to have a positive effect on the organization in its tininess where you are. And the thinking is, from people like Margaret and others, is that if enough of us start in this very sort of modest way to try and positively affect the people around us in our immediate vicinity, little by little, we can create what is broadly known as an agglomeration effect. So if enough people are talking and behaving in a particular way, then we might be able to start seeing some changes. Is it going to happen overnight? I don't think so. The other thing to say as well is to encourage the idea that compassion and empathy it's not just about being kind. Actually, as a compassionate leader, sometimes you have to make decisions that may not be popular with everyone. It's not a competition to see who can be liked the most. And I think that's what makes compassion so challenging, but at the same time so potentially very rewarding if you can get it, if you can get it right. Natasha says here, a person is just as culpable if they don't call out bullying or unkind behavior and put a stop to it. Absolutely. And we see, I attended a session in Singapore recently on bullying. And they did a poll there were about 100 people there. Most of the people had experienced bullying in one shape or form. And one of the things that I think surprised a lot of the members of the audience was that bullying could also happen from subordinates as well. So it's not just managers, and it's not just peers either, but it can happen from subordinates too. And for those of you who are probably way more knowledgeable about this than I am, we see the phenomenon, for example, of we call it gaslighting, and this is a technique very often used by those narcissistic profile type people that we touched on before, where they decide that they want to try to get rid of or remove a competitor, or sometimes it can just be somebody they just don't like. And what they will do little by little in a very progressive but very deliberate way is to slowly undermine that person's personal credibility. And they can do it in such a way that the person themselves starts to doubt whether they have the expertise that brought them into the job in the first place. And the reason why it's called gaslighting is that it comes as a result of a play, a theatre play that was very popular in London around the turn of the last century, where a husband and his mistress, his lover, they try to convince the man's wife that she can smell gas in their apartment. And little by little, by working on this, they slowly drive the wife mad, because the idea is they want to get rid of the wife so that the husband and the mistress can go off into the sunset together. So that's where the term gaslighting comes from. And we see it as a very, very big issue across the world. And it was very interesting to see that in Singapore as well, that it was there. So a lot of things going on, I think, in our workplaces. Okay. So I'm sure, I hope I'm not opening up too many wounds as I talk here about these things, but I think it's really important if we're to sort of have a deep and meaningful discussion about compassion, empathy, and human workplaces, that we really do recognize some of the tremendous issues that we're dealing with in terms of toxic work environments. Alice says, I witnessed this, bullying their team, shouting at staff, but what's the best approach to address it when the leader has a big ego? Alice, I wish I had a magic wand and I could say that I'll just wave my magic wand for you, and hopefully this will be the thing that makes it go away. The problem that we have is that very often these kinds of leaders are inherently extremely difficult to remove, because very often they've been put in that position by a board that doesn't really know exactly what they have hired to be in charge. I'll give you an example. When we think about companies like Nokia, when we think of companies like Volkswagen, some of the business issues, the ethical issues that those organizations have undergone. So come back to Nokia. The reason why Nokia failed really to reinvent itself as Apple was coming out with the iPhone was it's been popularly ascribed to the fact that they were slow to innovate. But if you look behind the scenes, you then find that the CEO at that time made shouting at people an everyday practice. He would walk the corridors literally yelling at people. And I've seen, I'd have to dig it out, but I've seen correlations between lack of psychological safety and being shouted at. Now that may sound like a strange thing, but the fact is, when human beings are shouted at, that is an extremely damaging thing for that individual. So at Nokia, the CEO used to just walk around yelling at people. So you can imagine that he did not create any kind of psychological safety that would then support innovation and creativity and enable Nokia to perhaps reinvent itself. So when we scratch beneath the surface of what looks like business issues that brought a company down, very often there's much more to the story. And more often than not, it's a human story. And more often than not, it's to do with the toxic leadership that was in place at that time. So the Volkswagen emissions scandals in the United States, for example, the bosses basically said to the people, you have to here's a choice. You have to falsify the emissions data to enable us to sell diesel cars in North America, choice one, or we remove you. So up to you. What do you want? Do you want to play along with what we're doing, or do you want us to fire you? That level of bullying and intimidating behavior, it's unbelievable. Even as I'm sharing that with you, unbelievable that things like that happen. But they happen, and they happen every day, and they happen all around the world. So we have a huge job to do to try to change attitudes in workplaces. So I guess a long exposition on that particular point. But bullying, I think, is something that as compassionate leaders, we need to really call out. And Nat, thanks for making a point about that. Marley, over to you.
I think I have one more question for you. So, how do we balance empathy and the need for team discipline? And is it possible?
This is a wonderful question, you know, because I've talked to many what you might call frontline managers, and they will say that the notion of being a compassionate, empathetic leader is very appealing to them. But this is a genuine concern that people have, because they feel that being compassionate or being empathetic runs the risk of them being seen as what we might call a soft touch. In other words, they think that if they come across as compassionate and empathetic, that people will take advantage of that, and that it will make it harder for them to, in their worldview, and this is where we have to empathize with the way they think that they will not be able to hold their people accountable for reaching their goals. And the problem with all of this, Molly, is that we have to change the frame completely. It's not about worrying whether you can be a compassionate leader and hold people accountable. What it's about is changing the frame so that you create a trusting environment such that people feel that they are entrusted to do the work, and that you as their manager are there to support them, to remove obstacles, rather than to be constantly checking in with them. So I'll give you some examples. I've heard of an organization in Malaysia where they have made it mandatory to have an 8 o'clock morning meeting every day, Monday to Friday. And when people said, why do we have to have this meeting every day, Monday to Friday, 8 o'clock? The reason is because managers are worried that with work from home, they cannot be sure that their people are clocking in at the right time. So they think that by having this mandatory morning meeting, they can force people to get online at 8 o'clock. And then the hope is that they will then stay online and continue to do their work. And this kind of thing is so misplaced and misguided in terms of trying to address the issue. So the issue is much more around creating that psychological space and enabling people to do their best work without being monitored. Again, another thing that we hear is, and some people champion this. Actually, I had a colleague the other day who said, if you do this workshop for us, Michael, and you say these things, people will know that it's an elliptical criticism of some of our leaders. And I said, well, you know, we have to be brave, and we have to say it as it is. So, for example, there are people who will absolutely insist that people on the Zoom call have to switch on their camera, for example, that they're not allowed to keep their camera off. And they think that this is great because it means we're all together, we can see each other, etc., etc. But I would argue that it is showing a singular lack of empathy. In other words, I know from talking to people in Singapore and beyond that there is no way that people want to always show themselves on camera, for the reason being that behind them, they might have their aged dad who's lying on a couch behind them in his string vest. There is nowhere else for him to go. That's where he has to be, and there isn't anywhere else for them to take the call. So what we need to be saying is to the managers is, before you think that this is the answer, to have to insist that everybody puts their camera on, and I know this might not be a popular position, just have a think about it. Put yourself in the shoes of that person. There is a reason why they don't want to switch their camera on, and please don't force them to do it if they don't want to. Be more compassionate, and that's just a very simple example of how I think we could be more compassionate. So we've got some great links being provided in the chat. So thank you so much, everybody, for doing that. That's great. Yes, and Brent is saying, yeah. Marley, say, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so a comment from Brent. So it seems we shift to sociopathic tyranny when people remain bystanders or tolerate the intolerant. So to some extent, everyone is enabler of those behaviors in their ways.
Yeah, Brent, it's a great observation. I think if we do not sort of, as it were, deliberately press the pause button and say this kind of behavior in organizations is not acceptable, we do become tacit bystanders and complicit in that kind of behavior. The problem is, of course, that we're dealing with a monolith here in many organizations where traditional ways of managing and leading people are now coming under tremendous scrutiny. It's going to take time for us to really get rid of some of the monoliths of the past, and quite frankly, the tyrannical way in which people have been managed and led historically. I think we would all agree this is a task that is not an overnight type of job, that it's something that we have to sort of tackle over time. But I do believe that if all of us, in our own way, we chip away by ourselves, if necessary, at this monolith, that we can make a difference. And this is why I truly believe that altruism, which is a relatively understudied area compared with compassion and empathy, I think altruism is really going to come to the fore. And the reason why I say that is that as particularly younger people come into our workforce, younger people are asking critical questions. Is this an organization I actually want to work for? Is the CEO of this organization talking about the things that matter to me about sustainability in the broader sense, not just climate change, sustainability of the planet, but gender equality, for example, giving a voice to those disadvantaged parts of our community that don't have a voice. It's about giving access to people who literally see the world differently to us. So how much work are we doing, for example, to enable people who are, for instance, on the autism spectrum to be able to come into our organizations? With a little bit of creativity, compassion, thoughtfulness, we could make our workplaces so much more accessible to a broader range of people. And that's where we would also get cognitive diversity as well, which, as we know, is hugely beneficial for organizations. So some great comments coming here. Yeah, Dennis says, no altruism at work and bosses don't help. They might actually add to the problem, and there's no psychological safety. Yes, exactly. So this is a huge issue that we have to deal with. For those of you, I'm sure you've probably come across it already, but if you want to read more deeply about psychological safety, I think probably one of the books of the moment is by the Harvard professor Amy Edmondson, and she talks about psychological safety in her book, which is called The Fearless Organization. So that's got some wonderful stories in there about organizations that suffered from a lack of psychological safety. But that, I think, is one of the key things we need to be looking at going forward. Okay. Definitely.
Thank you, everyone, for bringing up your questions, and Michael for addressing them all. So will there be any more questions? If none, so as mentioned, we have a few minutes left to wrap things out, and I think we're just right on the clock. So a last comment from Sharon. So, she agreed with Brent and Dennis, but it is what it is. So particularly in Asia. But Michael is right to say we chip away and start with ourselves to be that positive force to shape culture.
Thanks, Sharon. That's great.
So yeah, if there's no more questions, I think we can show our slides now, Melvin. Okay, so just to if anyone from the audience like to have a copy of the slides that Michael presented, so just let us know and we'll be happy to send it over to you.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we would love to receive feedback from you. So flashed right in front of your screen is a QR code of the feedback form. So anyone from the team can send it to chat box. Oh, it's already there. So the link is also sent into the chat box. So head right on and tell us what you feel about today's session and how we can improve, or if you have any suggestions for our next event. And while you're doing that, let me take this moment to thank, firstly, our guest expert for today, Michael Jenkins, for the wonderful session. So thank you so much. And next, the P-Pro team for bringing this event into the reality. And of course, the warmest thank you to all the audience that we have here for participating and making this discussion engaging. So if you find this session useful for you, we highly encourage you to check the other sessions that we have for the whole month of August. So yeah, this has been Marley from P-Pro, and we'll see you all at the next session.